I'm Bonnie Lin, Director of the ChinaPower Project and Senior Fellow for Asian Security at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. In this episode of the ChinaPower podcast, we are joined by Dr. Oriana Skylar Mastro, who will be discussing her upcoming book on China's rise to great power status. China has developed its economy and military at a stunning rate, emerging from civil war and chaos of the Cultural Revolution to become a world-class military power in a matter of decades. How and why was China able to rise to power in such a short period of time? Dr. Mastro discusses this and more in her book, Upstart, How China Became a Great Power, which is now available on Amazon. Oriana Skylar Mastro is a Center Fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and Courtesy Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford University, where her research focuses on Chinese military and security policy, Asia-Pacific security issues, war termination, and coercive diplomacy. She is also a non-resident scholar at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and she continues to serve in the United States Air Force Reserve at the Pentagon. An expert on the Chinese military, she has written for Foreign Affairs, Journal of Strategic Studies, The Economist, and International Security. Dr. Mastro earned her MA and PhD from Princeton University. Thank you for joining us today, Oriana.
Thank you for having me.
Upstart provides a very unique take on China's rise to great power status. What motivated you to write this book, and what is the meaning behind the title Upstart?
Well, I had had a lot of experiences, both in academia, but also in the government and the military as a China specialist, trying to explain to people in the US system how China views things and how they would possibly respond to other things. I mean, my bread and butter is basically advising on how to best deter China or shape their choices. And I found that the biggest issue I came up against was not that people were underestimating the China challenge or overestimating it. It was that there were some gross mischaracterizations on it. It was like mirror imaging, but something even deeper. It was really hard for people to get out of the sort of US mentality to assume that everything China wanted, everything they were going to do would be exactly the same way as the United States would do it. So I'd been trying to convince people for a long time that China would act differently in some cases than the United States. And I felt like I had to gather a lot of data and write a whole book in order to be convincing on that point.
And to gather all this data to be convincing, not only in arguing what China is doing on the military side, but also have chapters devoted to China's foreign policy and economic policy, how many years did it take you?
Well, I have to say that this book took a little less time than the last one, but it was my sole effort over the course of 3.5 years. One of the issues with the data gathering, again, is because we engage in mirror imaging, you can find data and a lot of the types of activities that the United States engages in. So, for example, if you wanted to know what joint exercises the Chinese military does, that information is very easily found because we are paying attention to the things that they do that are like us. But as I argue in the book, they do many things differently than us. And so when I wanted to find out how many police forces they had trained around the world versus militaries, that was something that wasn't readily available. So it took a lot of skimming through both English and Chinese sources to put together some of those data sets just to present an accurate picture of China's role in the world and how it was building power before I could even embark on the argument of how China determined which strategies to pursue.
And why did you name your book Upstart? And could you also share with us what is the main argument or thesis of your book?
So the term upstart is a reference to some of the business literature when you have small companies or startups that are trying to break into established markets where you have a monopoly, you have a big company. And I found that a lot of the literature on competition in the business world really opened my eyes to some of the things that China was doing. If you think about a business, it doesn't make any sense that a new company would try to produce the exact same product or provide the exact same service in the exact same way when it doesn't have a customer base or it has fewer resources. And yet we assume that's how China is going to compete with us. But instead, it makes sense to be more entrepreneurial, to try to find the gaps of competition and insert themselves into those places. And so the term upstart is not only from that startup culture, but there's also this connotation that I think you hear a bit in the US discourse of maybe China has now grown too big for their britches, right? That maybe China is overreaching. And that's a big part of the debate as well. The sentiment in the United States that this growth of the Chinese power set, economic, political, and military over the past 30 years has just been so vast. So the big argument of the book is to take it as a given that the past 30 years, they have been successful at building power. We can, and I'm sure we will on this podcast, debate the next 30 years, but at least since 1995, all indicators from economic power, having an economy smaller than France's, to now having the second largest economy, political power, not having key relations with countries like South Korea, to now having more diplomatic presence in Asia than the United States, and activity in international institutions, to military power, which in some scenarios now the Chinese military could possibly defeat the US military, when 25 years ago, their pilots couldn't even fly, over water and during weather. It is clear that they've been successful. So the book asks, how did they do it? And I argue that they choose this upstart strategy, which has three components. They decide when to emulate the United States, when to exploit gaps, and when to be entrepreneurial. So emulation just means they take on the same strategy that the United States has in the same areas of competition. This is what most people assume China would do, whether it's academics or policymakers. The second component, exploitation, is when they adopt the US strategy, but in areas where the United States isn't really competing, where there's blind spots that allow them to make gains. And the last one is when they try to be entrepreneurial. They, for many reasons, decide, the US strategy is not the way to go. And so they do something completely different to try to build that form of power.
And do you see across these three different strategies, emulation, exploitation, and being more entrepreneurial, that China leans one way or the other? Or is it very mixed across, if you're looking at China's foreign policy, economic policy, and military policy?
I think it is quite mixed. The interesting thing is the factors that shape which one of those E's to pursue, right? Whether they're going to do emulation, exploitation, or entrepreneurship. And there's 5 things that I found that over time during this 30-year period shape that decision for the Chinese. The first is an evaluation of how effective US strategy has been. The second is how the United States is most likely to interpret that behavior. So one example is a lot of cases if China thinks, if I build power in this way, I actually reassure the United States. For example, joining international institutions, participating in peacekeeping operations. They were able to expand their power base, but it also had this upside of reassurance. While some other types of power, perhaps building overseas bases or seeking alliances with countries like Russia, or Iran, and North Korea, would be more threatening. That would be costly. The third thing they look at is how efficient the approach is, because if you're rising, by definition, you have to be doing something quicker and at a lower cost point than the United States in order to catch up. And the fourth is the liabilities of the approach. So this looks at their competitive advantages. There's some things that China recognizes the United States is very good at. Right? I gave the example of building alliances. Chinese strategists look at that and they say, that has done great things for the United States, but as a second mover, it doesn't really make sense for China to do it. It would have so many costs in terms of isolating the United States and its allies and partners, and the benefits of being closer to countries that are remaining like the Irans of the world aren't high enough to offset it. And of course, Communist Party control is a big aspect here. There are some strategies that are very effective for the United States, like how the United States has this dollar diplomacy and the dominance of the dollar in the international system, but releasing and restricting to a lesser degree export controls to facilitate the internationalization of the renminbi is not possible because it would hurt party control. And the last thing they look at is whether there's gaps or blind spots or vulnerabilities to exploit. So it's a bit complex, but in the book, I go through those 5 factors. And whenever I show that either China is emulating or exploiting or being entrepreneurial, I look at the Chinese language, literature, leadership speeches to try to get behind the logic. And it looks like it's a mix of those factors that determine which one they choose.
Great. Thank you, Oriana. Before we go into each of the three strategies or components, I do want you to help contextualize your book, given the growing literature on China. You're probably very familiar with Rush Doshi's book, The Long Game, whereas you describe three strategies: emulation, exploitation, entrepreneurship. He talks about three phases in China's approach towards the United States when you look at the last 3 or 4 decades. So how do the arguments in your book build on or differ from the argument that he was making in terms of the long game that China has played over time?
Well, I think Russia's approach is generally correct when I look at his argument about China becoming more forceful over time at revising the international order. I don't necessarily disagree with it. I think there's sort of a couple of differences between my approach and that. The first is that when he talks about Chinese ambitions, he does kind of assume that China is going to do things in the same way as the United States. I have a big section in the book, for example, about how China has not built overseas bases despite a lot of the predictions over the past 30 years. And I don't expect them to in the future. And that's not because the Chinese aren't ambitious. It's not because they don't have the capability to do so. I think a lot of Russia's argument is about Chinese power and capability, that they would emulate the United States if they had the capability to do so. But in the case of overseas bases and a lot of others, there are other factors that are influencing Chinese decisions. And in this case, the Chinese strategic community has determined that foreign military intervention as a tool of foreign policy is just a really ineffective and costly way of doing business. And so I think part of it is looking at the more detailed how. Russia is very focused on, what they want. My book basically argues that China wants as much power as possible to have the freedom of maneuver, that they want to determine their future. And I don't think China really knows, even in a lot of cases, what they're going to want in 30 years from now. But what they do know is they want the power to follow that whenever they decide. And the other thing is the book sort of highlights the situations under which China's strategy would change if China became more or less powerful. So in some cases, when the Chinese mindset is that they find a US strategy particularly attractive or effective, but because they don't have competitive advantages in those areas, they won't pursue it. Those are some areas we might expect in the future the Chinese position to change. The last thing I'll say about Russia's position about China being more expansionist after 2016, there is one factor that influences Chinese thinking that has reduced over time, that I think has manifested itself in the way that Rush lays out. And that's the Chinese were extremely concerned and prioritized minimizing the threat perception that they gave to the United States in the early stages of their rise. As they became more powerful, and especially after the United States declared it was in a competition with China, and especially the Trump administration, which was pretty aggressive about that competition, the value of trying to pursue strategies that seem more reassuring decreased in the strategic mindset of the Chinese. And so I think what Russia's pointing to of that expansionist tendency is the idea that this one factor out of the 5, the desire not to come off as threatening to the United States, has decreased in power over time.
Thank you, Oriana. That's super helpful. Your book also references the theory of China peaking. How do the 3 components that you identify of China's strategy align with or differ from arguments that China's power has or will peak?
Well, first, let me say about this peaking argument. As someone who is not an economist, I cannot independently assess the likelihood that the Chinese economy is going to suffer under some of the structural problems that it's currently facing. I will just say, as someone who's looked at this for a number of decades, that US scholars have been pointing to Chinese weaknesses for years, some even predicting impending collapse. So the first point I would make is I think it's far from certain that China's economic future will be bleak. But the Upstart perspective suggests that this is problematic even to think about a peaking China, because it assumes that China needs the same resources as the United States to achieve what the US achieves, and that the United States builds and exercises power in the same way. But even if it has problems in the future, China is going to be able to challenge the United States and possibly even displace the United States on the global stage without the same types of power, the same amount of power. The book shows that over the past 25 years, 30 years, when China was competing from a weaker resource position than the United States in all areas, military, political, economic, they were still quite successful at competing for power with the United States. So there's no reason they could not continue to do so. So even if China's growth completely stalls, you're at 0%, China will still have more resources in the next 25 years than they've had in the past 25 years. And I think in the past 25 years, they've done a pretty good job at creating some headaches for us.
Excellent, thank you. This helps understand the main findings of your book compared to some of the other perspectives on China. Next, I'd like to focus on the 3 E's that you describe in your book. Could you give an example of each E, emulation, exploitation, and entrepreneurship, and explain what each involves? Let's start with emulation. From your perspective, what is an example of China engaging in emulation vis-a-vis the United States?
Right. So emulation is when they pursue the same strategy as the United States in a similar area. And in the book, just to point out, I have 22 case studies of these approaches since 1995. So one example of emulation is mediation diplomacy in the political realm. So China has determined that you get a certain amount of influence and clout by serving as a mediator in international disputes. And so they have presented themselves and played that role in a number of cases. And I feel like it's very efficient. There was one Chinese, not ambassador, but a minister, a high-level minister, who commented that their role in the six-party talks cost them the amount of a couple cups of coffee, but earned them praise on the international stage. Emulation is also what they did in international institutions when they recognized that there was some institutional power associated with a proactive role. And I have this data set that I talk about in the book, of which they purposefully and deliberately seized key senior management and leadership roles within international institutions, in particular the United Nations, to be able to shape the agenda of those organizations in ways that were more favorable to China. And so they recognized that the United States had a lot to gain from those types of institutions and therefore emulated the approach. On the military side, let me just point out that there are some cases in the book that I argue that China chose incorrectly, that factors outside of those 5 I laid out pushed them to do things that were not in their best interests. And 2 of those cases happen to be in the field of emulation. So in foreign policy, I argue that soft power, their obsession with trying to compete with the United States for soft power when they don't have the competitive advantages to do so, has ultimately been a failure in terms of any measurement of soft power has not increased for China, but they spend a lot more on public diplomacy and other efforts in the United States. But I also put the aircraft carrier in that category, that for many years, for decades, China was correct and they were being more entrepreneurial, and they were pointing out that the aircraft carrier was costly, that they didn't want to directly compete with the United States in that area, that they wouldn't be able to compete, but the desire for prestige got the best of them. And they have now poured money into these aircraft carriers that are vastly inferior to US capabilities. So that would be the first case, I would say, of emulation. And then, of course, there's a desire to internationalize the renminbi and promote free trade, with Chinese characteristics, of course, but opening themselves up to trade as a source of power and influence would be some examples of emulation in the economic realm.
Awesome, thank you. And could you give a couple of examples on the exploitation side? My understanding of exploitation is that it means that China is trying to compete in areas where the United States is relatively weakened. Is that a correct interpretation?
Right. So this is where they say, the US strategy really works, but it won't work for us to do it in the exact same areas. For example, high-level diplomatic visits. So when presidents go and visit another country, this can really help promote the interests of a country. China, of course, engages in those high-level diplomatic visits like the United States. But what we see from one of the data sets I put together is they visit different countries than those that the United States visits. So there's sort of a gap in where senior US leaders are going, and those are the places that Chinese leaders tend to go. For example, no US president has ever visited Central Asia. Chinese leaders go there a lot. Xi Jinping has visited the majority of countries in Africa, 70% of the poorest countries there that, no US president has ever visited. And so in that case, they are taking that US strategy, but employing it in different areas. Also in foreign policy, arms sales is a good example in which that's not a key tool. China is not competing for US customers, but they basically sell arms to countries that can't buy them from the United States, either because of human rights violations and other arms embargoes, or they just don't have the resources to pay for the quality of US arms. So China doesn't have to compete directly with the US. They identify those gaps and they fill them. In the military realm, there's really no better example of this type of exploitation than what US military strategists refer to as the anti-access area denial strategy, which is a way of describing how the Chinese military has modernized over the past 3 decades. Basically, they've identified the exact vulnerabilities of the United States, what the United States relies on for power projection, and then they focus their modernization efforts on the ability to disrupt that process. So instead of having aircraft that are as good as the United States, they have the missiles that can take out the runways so US aircraft can't take off. That would be a key example of exploitation. And then in the economic realm, when you look at some of their free trade agreements, some of the areas where they're trying to promote the settling of trade in renminbi, again, these are with countries and in certain areas where the United States is not particularly active.
And Oriana, the final E, entrepreneurship. You mentioned in the book that that's an area where China is using new methods to compete, or that those are new methods in areas that the United States has not been very active in competition, or new methods in new areas of competition. Could you provide a couple examples of this?
Right. And this is actually the area where China gets most of its power by doing things differently than the United States. And let me just say, it's so important to highlight entrepreneurship because there's a lot of studies in behavioral economics that show when someone else does something differently than you, it takes you a while to recognize it. And then you tend to underestimate its effectiveness. If you can just think in your everyday life, someone else takes a different path, you might think, well, if that was going to work, I would have done it. And so you tend to discount it until it's too late. And I think that's happened a lot in the case of the United States. So in foreign policy, China doesn't have alliances. They have strategic partnerships. These are agreements that they sign with countries, with many US allies, for example, that don't have a defense component, but that articulate and commit the parties to prioritizing economic relationships over political disagreements. And the Chinese did this because they wanted to have close relations with US allies and partners, but they wanted to undermine the power that those alliances had to counter them in certain critical areas, in particular politically sensitive areas like human rights or their position on Taiwan. In the military realm, I would say this is the most controversial part of the book for many. I talk about China's nuclear strategy and their ability to protect overseas interests. I am not concerned right now about Chinese nuclear buildup. I think a lot of the discussion about China hoping to rush for parity, again, assumes China wants to build power the way the United States does. But all indications of their nuclear strategy, whether it's how many nuclear weapons they have, how they've housed them, what is the organization for them, how do they train, has all been so different from the US approach since China detonated its first bomb in 1964. And so they've been able to establish this nuclear deterrent without spending the amount of money that the United States has on the nuclear enterprise. Indeed, until the mid-2000s, China spent less on its whole military than we spent on our nuclear enterprise. And so this is one way that they've been able to compete. And in terms of overseas bases, China has relied on training host nation forces as well as economic tools to try to protect their growing commercial interests overseas and trying to avoid gunboat diplomacy to use military coercion to protect their commercial interests. And whether that will work in the future, we can have a discussion about it, but at least it has worked to date. And the last thing on the economic side, everyone has heard this term. The Belt and Road Initiative was extremely entrepreneurial, in which China recognized it had this competitive and comparative advantage in infrastructure development. There were also a lot of countries that were being largely ignored by the United States. They had some military vulnerabilities and concerns about sanctions and being blockaded by the US. So having overland routes for things was very attractive. And so they came up with this whole new and different idea to building and leveraging economic power. Now, whether it's quote unquote successful depends on the angle you look at it. Whether or not it's been good for the countries that sign on to it is a separate question. But the fact that countries continue to sign on to it and that China has economic leverage in a lot of places around the world right now, I think suggests that at least from a power position, it's been quite effective.
Thank you. Really appreciate you walking through the different examples of emulation, exploitation, and entrepreneurship. If I can ask, as you look across these three categories, do you see that China leans on one type of strategy more than another? So, for example, if you see China being more entrepreneurial and engaging in more exploitation when it's weaker, and then changing its strategy and perhaps shifting to emulation when it's stronger, you could make the argument that China's strategy is shifting because of its capabilities. And if it becomes stronger, it could still do what the United States wants, or try to achieve or have what the United States already has. So what are you seeing as you look across these three strategies and looking at China across time?
So I think this is what the real value of the Upstart approach is it can give us the conditions under which China's strategy will change in the future. The rationale behind a choice is really critical. So in some cases, when it looks like China chose an approach because, for example, they think the US approach is stupid, then it's unlikely, even as they get more powerful, they would pursue that approach. And that's the case with nuclear strategy and with the overseas bases. I think even as China gets richer, more capable, they're not going to be pursuing an approach that emulates that of the United States because they largely think the US approach is ineffective. In some areas of exploitation, it is true that China might want to compete more directly over time if they were able. But even there, sometimes China still has liabilities in terms of the nature of their system and the desire for party control that makes it difficult or undesirable for them to do things the way the United States would do them. So on the military side, there had been that kind of shift. For example, when the Chinese focused on building up a large navy, they recognized that power projection and naval power was important, that even though it was going to cause heightened threat perceptions in the United States, it was necessary to achieve some of their goals. And so in many cases, there was an emulative approach to that. As they got more powerful, they modernized their equipment and they invested not only in these A2AD capabilities to disrupt US power projection, but they started to focus on their own ability to project power. So I don't necessarily see that over time, there's some sort of convergence that the Chinese approach would emulate that of the United States, but they might switch between the strategies. So just as the United States got more powerful, it didn't then abandon international institutions or our overseas basing network in favor of a colonial empire, because that's what Great Britain had. We stuck to what was unique for us and what we found was effective. I feel like, largely speaking, China is going to do the same and still value the entrepreneurial approaches and the exploitation. If anything, a lot of the emulative approaches China pursued was because they felt like it was reassuring to the United States. And so while power might lead them to more directly compete in some cases, this view that the United States is going to find them threatening no matter what, it's kind of like a hopeless endeavor, has reduced the value of emulation in other cases. So it'll probably equal out over time to be the same percentage of the approaches as it has been in the past.
Thank you, Oriana. I know this is not the focus of your book, but to what extent does China's upstart strategy differ from strategies of prior great powers? Did prior great powers also embrace some sort of or some form of upstart strategy?
So I don't think that this is some sort of special Chinese cultural or historical approach. Now, of course, the book is just about China, so I can't say with 100% certainty. But looking across history, when I look at other great powers that have successfully rose, it does seem that they also pursued a similar type of upstart strategy. At the very least, they all had components of how they built power that were extremely entrepreneurial and different than their predecessors. We can see this about the United States and its own rise. And we can also look back in antiquity, right? What do we remember about the Roman Empire? What do we remember about the Persian Empire? Things that they did differently from their predecessors. Then we also see countries that rose that did not do quite so well. like Germany and Japan that rose and met conflict that led to a severe decrease in their power. And in those cases, I see that countries found them threatening actually quite early on because they were trying to emulate the great powers at the time, whether it was the Japanese realizing that naval power was so critical and then trying to build a navy that would rival that of other countries, or trying to pursue a colonial empire because that's what European countries did. It became very clear to the established great powers that there was a threat in their midst much earlier. So one of the things I look at in the book is military spending based on level of GDP over time. And China is unique in delaying military modernization to a very late stage of their rise compared to some of those countries that I pointed out. So China isn't unique in pursuing the upstart approach, but of course, then the mixture of emulation, entrepreneurship, and exploitation, and also the specific way that entrepreneurship is pursued, like with BRI or something like that, is based on China's own advantages and their own liabilities. And so the specifics of the strategies can be quite unique. Now, what this means for US policy, in the book, I have a number of recommendations about what the United States should do, but there are basically three things. And the first one is that the United States needs to stop trying to emulate all Chinese successes. We need to ask ourselves, just like China does, do we have a competitive advantage in this area? Is this something that we want to gear competition towards? The business literature calls emulating a challenger in every possible way position straddling. It's when a company tries to continue to do what they've done, continue their consistent long-term strategy while also trying to imitate a new challenger. And this often backfires. It's like when airlines were trying to compete with Southwest, and so they had the same pricing and the same fleets, except they reduced what they offered in terms of the services on board. It didn't quite work. And so a lot of people in the business space say that this isn't really the way that you should go about it because those competitive advantages are different. The second thing about emulation I want to say is there are cases in the book where China emulated when they shouldn't have. They didn't have the advantages. It was inefficient. And so I argue the United States, instead of being fearful of direct competition from China, we should do much more to try to encourage that emulation when it's beneficial. The desire for prestige, especially to reduce friction with the United States or to be a leader in the developing world, to have good relations with developed countries, have caused China to do some things that weren't in their best interest. So if, for example, we encourage them to be more proactive in some of those areas, that it could be more costly to them and help the United States compete. In terms of exploitation, the recommendation is pretty straightforward. One way China builds power is exploiting these gaps in US strategy and the international order, whether it's selling drones or engaging in diplomatic outreach to developing countries, developing those A2AD capabilities, stealing foreign technology to support its industrial policy. When China sees an opening, it'll exploit it. So the best way forward is for the United States to identify those gaps and then to close those gaps. And the last recommendation I make, in which I go into detail in specific issue areas, is the United States has to be much more entrepreneurial about its own approaches. We need to rethink the way that we build and exercise power to be competitive in this century. It is the case that established powers often have trouble doing new things, even when they're faced from a challenge from below. And this happens in industry too. Great powers like industrial leaders have less incentive to innovate because of their dominance. But this often can lead to decline because countries and companies cling to strategies that originally made them powerful. But as the nature of the international system changes, sometimes those strategies are no longer effective moving forward. And so I talk about specifics, whether it's the South China Sea, how to deal with territorial disputes, how to deal with rogue nations, what have you, in the book. And I obviously very much encourage everyone to read it. But the bottom line is I think we have to have an open mind about all US practices and deliberately consider whether it's time for a change in certain approaches.
You mentioned that the United States should avoid emulating PRC successes. Oriana, what do you see right now in DC that we're doing that you think is counterproductive and not beneficial to US policy?
So I think one example is the US approach to trying to offer infrastructure in the developing world to compete with the Belt and Road Initiative. And so we haven't had a lot of success with Build Back Better and some of these initiatives under the Biden administration and some initiatives in the Trump administration to try to offer an alternative to countries that were taking funds through BRI. And there was a number of reasons for this, but one that I would sort of posit to those who have greater expertise in development than I do is whether the United States really has a competitive advantage in infrastructure building, or if we have something else on offer. And some things that come to my mind are more in the education and healthcare, medical types of realms to the developing world that gives the United States the impression of being a good partner, that increases our role and our presence in these places, that doesn't necessarily only happen if we can outcompete China in that particular area.
Thank you. And in terms of your recommendations for U.S. entrepreneurship, one of them that stood out was on the South China Sea. You recommended expanding U.S. operations to include more escorting operations to support our allies and partners. You also mentioned a massive diplomatic efforts to get claimants in Southeast Asia to an agreement regarding disputed territories in the South China Sea. It seemed to me that both entrepreneurial recommendations would require significant U.S. funding and resources. I wanted to ask if this is a correct interpretation of your recommendations and if this suggests a reprioritization of U.S. resources.
Right. So the first point I think I would make as I approach any issue area, that when I present a recommendation to senior leaders, when they are not open to it, and I ask why, and the response is, that's just not how we do things, then I know that's an area that is really ripe for change. And so before I get into the specifics of the military realm, one that I don't think is necessarily more costly is this idea that when we have problems with countries, to punish them, we reduce our diplomatic presence or even cut off diplomatic relations, as in that those sort of diplomatic ties are considered a reward. But it's just as logical that we would enhance our engagement with those problematic countries to try to ensure the protection of US interests than it would be to cut them off. In the case of the South China Sea, one of the things I mentioned again that wouldn't cost anything extra is whether or not the United States should take a position on the territorial disputes in the South China Sea. Right now, the United States does not take a position. But if China continues to engage in dangerous activity, if the United States, to enhance its deterrent, really does need greater access, basing and overflight in the region, then it might be worthwhile to consider siding with Vietnam, for example, on their claims in the paracels, and just to really brainstorm that and game it out before we rule it out. Now, to your point, at increased resources, the U.S. Navy is not large enough, and nor do I think we could make it large enough or would want to make it large enough to be patrolling completely the South China Sea and escorting every vessel. But the way I think that you can enhance that deterrent is by always making it a possibility. It's more that the United States reserves the right to do this versus saying that we're always going to do it. And that has to influence China's cost calculus when they're engaging in gray zone activities in the area. So I think it's just that success requires new approaches that are more than just variations on an old theme, and instead try to think, for example, about pushing for an international regime to monitor and regulate the types of internal security cooperation between states that China is engaging in, training of police forces, being more proactive about trying to establish international institutions for norms of cyber AI, but also in space. And think beyond our traditional arms control approaches, in which we often think about reduction of nuclear forces on both sides. But my research suggests that China is not striving for parity. Even in the worst case scenarios, the United States will still have 6 times more nuclear weapons than China. But the real problem for the United States is the atrophy of our conventional deterrent in the Indo-Pacific. That opens up the possibility that Beijing might use force against Taiwan. And so I would argue the Chinese are never willing to come to the table on nuclear arms talks because, and I think rightfully so, they said, why should we reduce our arsenal when you currently have 18 times more nuclear weapons than we do? That we should be open to reducing US nuclear arsenal in exchange for reductions in Chinese conventional capabilities. So it's those types of recommendations, that people that aren't things that we have considered in the past that I think we need to consider moving forward.
Thank you. The final question I have for you is to ask you to look forward into the next 5, 10, or 15 years. If we assume, and again, this is an assumption, that China becomes stronger or more powerful, you had mentioned 5 different factors that China takes into account in terms of evaluating the choice between the 3 E's. Do you think one or more of these factors could become more or less important over time?
So I think for those factors, the one that could become less important over time is consideration of how the United States will perceive something. This has less to do with Chinese power and more their assessments of the nature right now of US-China relations, that it's unlikely that they can really continue to pursue power in any way that would be reassuring to the United States. So I think the most likely candidate for one decreasing in influence is how the United States would perceive a certain action. In terms of the others, you might see those factors being as influential, but leading to different strategies. So, for example, I think China will continue to assess their competitive advantages and their liabilities, but they might assess that they have more capabilities to be competitive in a certain area in the future than they have in the past. Maybe as their equipment and their weapons get more advanced, they will be more competitive and competing with the United States for the same clients for arms sales, for example. Not all, of course, because a lot of those clients are building capabilities to counter China, but some. So you would see the actual strategy and the components of the strategy changing, but that factor, that consideration of competitive advantages and liabilities would remain the same. And part of those liabilities, of course, is the CCP's desire to maintain political control and ensuring that none of the strategies they pursue undermine that control. Obviously, under Xi Jinping and the current trends that we see, I think that factor is only going to become stronger over time.
Great, excellent. Thank you very much, Oriana. I really appreciate the in-depth discussion of not only your book, but your analysis of the various strategies China has taken over time and the specific examples of each Chinese approach or strategy. It's a tremendous book that all listeners should read, and I highly recommend it. It provides a valuable and incredibly important contribution to our understanding of China. Thank you again for joining us, Oriana.
Yeah, thank you for having me.